He came up to me after 23 years of silence and said just one phrase that turned my life around in an instant: take a DNA paternity test. At first I couldn't believe my ears. Mark, my childhood best friend whom I hadn't seen in over 2 decades, was standing in front of me, and instead of the usual questions about how we were doing, he immediately issued this bizarre statement. We were standing in my store where I worked as a consultant, and instead of closing the door for the night, I just froze, trying to digest his words. Mark looked like a man who had seen a lot of grief. Worn jeans, an old jacket, a tired face with deep wrinkles, all of it told me that life hadn't spoiled him. But his eyes, despite everything, remained the same as 23 years ago, full of determination and some inner fire. We had once been inseparable, dreaming of the future together, making plans for our lives. But then our paths diverged, and he disappeared from my life as suddenly as he appeared now. Mark, what are you talking about? I asked, not believing my ears. What DNA test? He didn't answer right away. He sighed, lowered his gaze, and seemed to collect his thoughts before continuing. A shadow of regret flickered in his eyes, and then he finally spoke. Thomas, there's something I need to tell you, he began slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was about to say. But before I do, you must know the truth. And that truth could turn your whole life upside down. You have to take a DNA test. I was shocked. What kind of test? What truth was he talking about? Why now, after all these years? 1,000 questions swirled in my head, but I felt like the answers could change everything. And as soon as Mark said it, I knew this conversation was going to be long and hard. We left the store and headed to the nearest cafe. I had to find out what was behind his strange words, what was the secret that had been hidden from me for so many years. Mark was ready to talk, and I sensed we had a conversation ahead of us that would change my life forever. We were sitting in the corner of a small cafe, where the dim light of the bulbs barely illuminated our faces. It was starting to rain outside the window, and the sparse drops tapping on the glass made it feel like the world outside this room was getting farther away. The waiter brought 2 cups of coffee, and Mark wrapped his fingers around his own, as if it might warm him up, even though it was warm enough in the cafe. I stared at him, trying to figure out the expression on his face, and I still couldn't believe what was happening. Mark, you need to explain what this is all about, I began, feeling the anxiety building inside me. You come in after all these years and tell me to take a DNA test. Why? What do you mean? Mark took a sip of his coffee and set the cup aside. He was clearly trying to find the right words, but it was like he was starting over each time and didn't know where to begin. Finally, he spoke. Thomas, do you remember how many years ago you went to work in another city and Emma stayed here? He began without looking up at me. I nodded. It was one of the most difficult times in my life. I had just gotten married, Emma and I had a small apartment, and I had found a job in another city to provide for our family. It was hard to leave, but there was no other option. Emma supported me as much as she could at the time, but I knew it wasn't easy for her to be alone. We spent a lot of time together then, Mark continued, finally meeting my gaze. You were far away, and I thought I should help her, be there for her. We used to see each other a lot, talking about life, about you. But then something happened that I could never forgive myself for. I clenched my fists, not realizing where he was going with this, but already sensing that the answer would be painful. My heart froze as I waited for his next words. Emma told me she was pregnant once, he said, and I thought the words were louder than anything else in the small cafe. That's when I realized that the baby might not be yours. Mark's words came out of the blue. All those moments when I'd seen Emma happy, when I'd held Lucas, our son, in my arms, and I couldn't imagine that he might not be mine. My heart clenched with pain, and I could feel the anger starting to build in my chest. Are you saying that I started, but the words stuck in my throat. Mark nodded, his face sad, full of regret. I don't know exactly, Thomas. Emma and I were too close at the time, but then she decided to keep the marriage to you and told me the baby was yours. I didn't know what to do. I loved Emma, but I knew I couldn't ruin your life. So I left. I just disappeared. I thought it would be best for everyone, he continued, struggling to find the words. But now I realize I can't go on like this. You have to know the truth, no matter how terrible a blow it is. I leaned back in my chair, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Questions were swarming in my head, but I couldn't ignore the main one. If Mark was telling the truth, then my son, whom I had loved and raised for so many years, might not be mine. What do you suggest? I asked, trying to stay calm, though my insides were churning with emotion. I suggest you find out the truth, Mark answered. Take a DNA test. It's the only way. I realize it could ruin your life, but living a lie is worse. I've been thinking about this for years, Thomas, and now I realize you need to know the truth. The world around me began to fade. I realized I was on the verge of something irreversible. If Mark was telling the truth, then everything I knew about my life, about my family, could be a lie. But I also realized that if I didn't take this step, I would live with this doubt for the rest of my life. Okay, I finally said, trying to keep my voice firm. I'll do the DNA test. But Mark, if all of this is true, then what happens? How am I going to live with it? Mark didn't answer right away. He looked at me with sadness and understanding. It's your life, Thomas, he said quietly. And only you can decide how to live it. But I hope that, knowing the truth, you can find the strength to overcome it. I'm here to help you if you need it. I nodded, though I was still torn inside by doubt and pain. We sat in silence, and the rain outside the window grew heavier, as if nature had decided to intensify the drama of the moment. But now I had one clear decision. I had to find out the truth, whatever it was. The next day, I couldn't think of anything else. Mark's words literally stuck in my head, turning my thoughts and memories into a heavy, unbearable chaos. I tried to concentrate on my work, but I kept seeing images from the past. How I'd held Lucas in my arms in the hospital, how we'd gone to his first school assembly together, how I'd taught him how to ride a bike. All of those moments seemed shaky now, as if I'd woken up from a long sleep and didn't know what was real and what was a figment of my imagination. When the store finally closed, I decided to take the first step. I called the lab to find out how I could get a DNA test done. The woman on the other end of the line, as if she understood the delicacy of the situation, spoke in a calm, almost soothing voice. She explained that all she had to do was take saliva samples and send them for analysis. The result would be ready in a few days. I made an appointment for the next day. It seemed to be nothing complicated, but I felt something cold and heavy inside me clenching harder and harder with every word she said. In the evening I returned home and sat in silence for a long time, staring at one point. The house, which had always seemed like a fortress to me, had suddenly become alien and cold. I saw traces of Lucas everywhere, his textbooks on the shelf, old toys left behind, pictures on the walls. I tried to imagine that it was all part of someone else's life, that the boy I thought was my son might actually be someone else's son. Tears came to my throat, but I forced myself to hold them back. When Lucas came home after school, I greeted him as usual, but inside I was shattered. We ate dinner together, and he talked about how the day had gone. I listened to him, but it was like the words didn't reach my mind. I tried to look at him as a stranger, tried to see something in his features that wasn't mine, that could confirm Mark's words. But it was impossible. Everything about him seemed mine, from his smile to the way he spoke. After dinner, Lucas went to his room, and I stayed in the kitchen with my arms around my head. That's when I heard the front door open, and Emma walked in. She looked tired, but her face lit up with a smile when she saw me. "Hi, Thomas," she said as she came closer. "How was your day?" I could hardly contain the storm of emotions inside me. For the first time in years, I looked at Emma not as my wife, but as a woman who might be hiding something terrible from me. She reached out to hug me, but I pulled away. Her smile faded, and worry flashed in her eyes. "Is something wrong?" she asked, trying to figure out what was going on. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to decide how to start this conversation. My insides were churning with pain and anger, but I knew that everything depended on what she had to say. "Emma," I finally said, trying to speak calmly, though my voice still betrayed my tension. "I went out with Mark today." She froze. Her face paled, and her eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't find the words right away, and when she did, her voice shook. "Mark?" she whispered. "Had he come back? What did he say to you?" I looked up at her, full of pain and suspicion. "He told me something I couldn't accept. He said Lucas might not be my son." Her face contorted in an instant. She clearly hadn't expected this. Her hands trembled, and she clenched them into fists, as if trying to keep her hands on the surface in a swirl of emotion. "Thomas," she began, but her voice broke off. She tried to find the right words, but she couldn't seem to believe what was happening. This isn't true. You have to believe me. Lucas is your son." But her eyes gave her away. There was confusion, fear, and something else, something deeper, that made my heart clench in my chest. I couldn't hold back any longer. Why didn't you tell me then? Why did you hide it for so many years? I stood up, pushing my chair back sharply. Did you realize that if it was true, I'd been living a lie my whole life? She stepped toward me, trying to touch my hand, but I stepped back, unable to accept her touch. Thomas, I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Her voice broke into tears. Yes, there was something between Mark and I, but it was only once. I was confused, you left, and I made a mistake. But I was sure that Lucas was your son. I didn't want to ruin our life over that mistake. I clenched my teeth, trying not to snap. Emma's words cut me like knives. Everything I knew about our life together seemed to be crumbling before my eyes. Why didn't you tell me about it then? I asked again, trying to keep my voice under control, but I was seething inside. We could have worked it out together, figured out what to do. But you decided to just hide it from me? Decided I was better off living in ignorance? She covered her face with her hands, trying to hold back the tears. I thought it was best for everyone, she said through her sobs. I didn't want to destroy our family. And I was sure that everything would work out, that no one would ever know. Those words hit me hard. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen without looking at her, heading for the bedroom. I heard Emma yell something after me, but her words were drowned out in the chaos of my thoughts. Closing the bedroom door behind me, I sat on the bed, trying to come to my senses. Her words, afraid of losing you, echoed in my head. Maybe she was telling the truth, maybe she really did love me, but it didn't matter now. I felt a wall growing between us that was impossible to break down. The night passed in agonizing contemplation. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Pictures of the past stood before my eyes, and all of them were now painted in gray tones. Emma was crying quietly in the other room, but I couldn't bring myself to go to her. We were both broken, and I didn't know how to put the pieces of our lives back together again. I could barely stay on my feet in the morning. My head was foggy and my thoughts were jumbled like a nightmare. Lucas was still asleep, and I decided I needed to seize the moment. I had to think things through before he woke up. Emma sat at the kitchen table, gripping her coffee cup with both hands. She looked like she'd been up all night. The shadows under her eyes, the pale face all told me that she was also exhausted beyond belief. When I entered, she looked up at me with a look of anxiety and fear. Thomas, she said quietly, what are you going to do? I sat down across from her, trying to collect my thoughts. I'm going to take the DNA test anyway, I said, looking into her eyes. I need to know the truth. But what happens next? I don't know yet. She nodded, as if expecting that answer. We sat in silence, and time seemed to stand still. We were each absorbed in our own thoughts, but there was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. What if Lucas? What if he really isn't your son? Emma asked, not looking up. What would you do then? I was silent for a long moment, pondering her words. The answer was obvious, but it was too hard to say it out loud. I don't know, I finally answered, feeling the despair rising inside me. I just don't know. Emma closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. She tried to hold back, but it was no use. I could see her torn with guilt, but I couldn't find the strength to comfort her. In that moment, I realized that no matter the test result, our lives wouldn't be the same. Even if Lucas turned out to be my son, the fact that Emma was hiding the truth would stay between us. But if he turned out not to be mine, I couldn't imagine being able to look at him, my son, knowing that I'd been living someone else's life all this time. The days that followed this conversation seemed endless. I somehow kept going to work, even though every day was torture for me. Emma tried to get back in touch, but there was an insurmountable wall between us. I could see her trying to make things look the way they used to, but it only made me more tense. I avoided Lucas, afraid that any gesture or word I made would give away my doubts. Every time he asked me something or just started a conversation, I felt everything inside of me clench. I couldn't look him in the eyes without knowing who he really was. And that made it hurt even more. Finally, the day came to get the results of the DNA test. I drove to the lab alone, not telling Emma that I was going to do it today. I realized that she was living in anticipation of this moment too, but I didn't want to alarm her further. Or maybe I was just afraid of her reaction. When I arrived, it felt like time had stopped. Everything looked normal in the lab, but the only thing I saw about this place was that it was the place where my life could change forever. I signed the necessary paperwork, and a few minutes later, I was handed a sealed envelope with the results. I walked outside and stopped at the nearest bench. I was holding an envelope that could ruin or confirm my entire life. I did not dare to open it for a long time, looking at the passers-by who were hurrying about their business, not suspecting that at that moment I was standing on the threshold of something terrible. Finally, I made up my mind. Slowly, with trembling hands, I opened the envelope and took out a piece of paper. For the first few seconds I couldn't understand what I was seeing, but then all the letters and numbers began to form into understandable words. The result was positive. Lucas was my son. I sat on the bench, unable to believe it. My head was a buzzing mess, and I tried to realize that everything was now the same. But the relief I expected to feel didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness. After all, no matter the outcome, the days I had spent in doubt had already left their mark. I slowly got up and walked home. The sun was shining outside, and the people around me seemed happy. But for me, it was only a reminder of how close I had come to the edge of the abyss. When I returned, Emma met me at the door. Her face was pale, and she kept her eyes on me. She was clearly waiting for an answer. "Lucas is my son," I said, handing her the results. Her face lit up with joy and relief in an instant, but I couldn't share her feelings. The pain I'd felt when I'd learned the truth still lingered inside me. "Thomas," she whispered, coming closer and wrapping her arms around me. I always knew. I was so afraid you wouldn't forgive me. But I couldn't hug her back. Her embrace was unaccustomedly cold, as if there was an invisible wall between us that could not be broken even by such close gestures. I stood there, unmoving, feeling what used to be between us fade away. Even knowing that Lucas was really my son, I couldn't shake the bitterness of betrayal, the realization that my wife had been hiding the truth all these years. Emma took a step back, watching me intently, her smile slowly fading. She sensed something was wrong between us, but she couldn't find the right words to fix it. There was fear in her eyes, mixed with hope that things would get better, but I knew that our relationship would never be the same again. "Thomas, please," she said softly, as if afraid of waking something dangerous. "Give us a chance. Give yourself a chance. We can make it back, I'm sure of it. We can be happy again, like we used to be." I was silent, trying to understand how I felt. But there was only emptiness in me, as if everything that filled me before was gone, leaving only a shell capable of functioning on automatic. I wanted to tell her that I wanted it all back too, that I wanted to feel the closeness we had again, but the words stuck in my throat. There was a voice inside that kept repeating the same thing. "She betrayed you, she lied to you." Of course, here's the altered text. I don't know, I said finally, averting my eyes. "I need time, Emma. I need to make sense of all this." She tried to move closer again, but I stepped aside, not wanting to let her ruin the distance that had now grown between us. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Take as much time as you need. But please remember that I will always be there for you, no matter what you decide." I nodded, but didn't answer. It seemed to me that words meant nothing now, that they were just empty words in this new reality where doubt and mistrust ruled. A few weeks passed. I continued to live with Emma and Lucas under the same roof, but every day was like torture. Emma tried to be there for me, trying to bring the warmth back into our relationship, but her efforts only made me feel more conflicted. I could see her anguish, trying to make amends, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there would always be a shadow of what had happened between us. Lucas didn't seem to notice the change in our relationship. He went on with his life, going to school, doing his own thing, but I couldn't look at him the same way I used to. The inner voice was still telling me that despite the test result, I was betrayed. I tried not to show my feelings, but every time he turned to me, I felt something inside me clench. One evening when I got home from work, I found Emma in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, clutching a cup of cooled tea in her hands, her face sunken in thought. I stopped in the doorway, not knowing how to start a conversation. A storm of emotion was raging inside me, and I felt like I couldn't hold it all in anymore. "Emma," I began, and she flinched when she heard my voice. "We can't go on like this." She raised her head slowly, her eyes full of fatigue and sadness. She was obviously expecting me to say something like that, but she still wasn't ready for the words. "What do you want to say, Thomas?" she asked quietly, trying to remain calm. I sighed, trying to find words that wouldn't hurt her too much, but I knew it was impossible. "I can't forget what happened. I can't just forgive you for hiding it from me for so many years." I know Lucas is my son, but every time I look at him, I remember that you could have ruined it all in one moment. Her eyes filled with tears and she covered her face with her hands, but I continued, feeling the need to finally say everything that had built up inside. I've tried. I've tried to live like I used to, but it's impossible. You broke the trust we had, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. She burst into tears, her shoulders shuddering with sobs, but I knew I had to continue despite the pain I was causing her. I love Lucas. He's my son, and I'll always be there for him. But I can't go on living with you the way I used to. I need time to think things through. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I can't stay here right now. She looked up at me with eyes full of tears and pain and tried to object, but I shook my head. Not now, Emma. Please, not now. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone, and went upstairs to the bedroom. As I gathered my things, I felt everything inside clench with pain, but realized that this decision was inevitable. I rented a small apartment in a nearby neighborhood, where I was able to get away from the memories and everything that connected me to my former life. For the first time I felt like I was in a fog, lost and alone, but I knew it was the only way to rebuild myself, to figure out what to do next. Emma called several times trying to talk to me, but I didn't answer her calls. I knew that sooner or later we would have to talk, to decide what to do about our marriage, but I wasn't ready for that yet. All I could do was disconnect from the past to make sense of my feelings and sort myself out. Lucas tried to reach out too, and I tried to talk to him, but those conversations were short and strained. I felt like I couldn't fully return to a normal relationship with him, even though it wasn't his fault what had happened. It wasn't fair to him and I was aware of that, but there was nothing I could do. Gradually life began to fall into place, but there was still an emptiness in my soul. I often thought about what had happened and what was ahead of me. I knew that I couldn't live alone forever, that I would have to decide what to do about my marriage, but every time I thought about it, I felt anger and resentment rise up inside. One evening, sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, I suddenly realized that I couldn't put off talking to Emma any longer. I had to meet with her to decide what would happen next. We couldn't live in uncertainty forever. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. She answered almost immediately, as if she had been expecting my call. Thomas? Her voice was full of hope and anxiety. We need to talk, I said quietly. We can't go on like this. Yes, of course, she was clearly ready for this conversation. When can you meet? Tomorrow night, at the cafe where we met Mark, I suggested. That place, it would be appropriate. She agreed, and I felt the tension inside rise before the upcoming meeting. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that we would have a lot to discuss and difficult decisions to make. But I also knew that it was the only way to move forward. The next night, I arrived at the cafe early. The same place where I'd first heard the truth from Mark now seemed even darker and heavier. I sat down at the same table where we'd sat then and stared at my coffee cup for a long time, trying to collect my thoughts. Emma came in shortly after me. She looked tired, but still beautiful, despite the excitement she'd been through. Her eyes, like mine, were full of anxiety and uncertainty about the future. We ordered a cup of coffee and sat in silence for a while, not knowing where to begin. Finally, I decided to speak. Emma, I began, struggling to find the words. I've been thinking a lot about this. About what happened and what we should do next. It hasn't been easy, and I'm still not sure I'm ready for everything that's ahead of us, but I realized one thing. She listened intently without interrupting. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she tried to hide it by crossing them on the table. I realize that you can't just forget what happened. But I don't want it to ruin our lives. I can't erase everything we had, all the years we spent together. Despite the pain I've experienced, I don't want to lose you and Lucas. Hope flickered in her eyes for a moment, but she remained wary, not daring to fully believe what I was saying. Thomas, I'm so glad you decided to talk to me. I've been thinking all this time about how we can fix what happened. I know that I made mistakes and that our trust is broken, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get it back. I want us to be a family again, for Lucas to feel safe and know that you and I are together. I nodded, but I was still uneasy inside. Even though I had made my decision, the residue of betrayal remained. But I knew that if I wanted to move forward, I had to try to forgive, try to find the strength to do so. I want that too, I said. But we're going to have to go through a lot of difficulties. We're going to have to learn to trust each other again. It won't be easy, and I don't know how long it will take, but I'm willing to try." Emma breathed out in relief, her eyes filling with tears, but this time they were tears of joy and relief. "Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for being willing to give us a chance. I promise I will do everything in my power to earn back your trust. I love you, and I don't want to lose what we had." I took her hand, feeling a connection between us again for the first time in a long time. We sat like that for a long time, holding each other's hands, silent, but there was more to that silence than all the words we'd said in the past weeks. A few months passed. Emma and I decided to make a fresh start, trying not to dwell on the past, but it wasn't easy. Trust is a fragile thing, and rebuilding it took time and effort on both sides. We started with simple things: dinners together, walks, talking about what was bothering us. Emma tried to be honest with me about everything, and I shared my doubts and fears too. Lucas noticed that something had changed, but Emma and I tried not to involve him in our problems. To him, we were still parents who loved and cared for him, and that was what mattered. Gradually, I began to feel the wound of betrayal healing. It was a slow process, and at times I would slip back into my fears and doubts, but with each passing day I realized that I was ready to put the past behind me. One evening as Emma and I sat on the veranda of our house watching the sunset, I felt like this was a new phase in our lives. I turned to her and said quietly, "I think we made it, Emma. I still haven't forgotten what happened, but I can see how we have changed. We've gotten stronger, and I believe we can get through this together." She smiled, and in her eyes I saw the same feeling that once brought us together. It wasn't just fear of losing each other, but real affection, tested by time and hardship. "I think so too, Thomas," she said, squeezing my hand. "We've been through a lot, but if we can get through this, then nothing can destroy us." We sat side by side, enjoying the silence and the peace that had finally returned to our lives. There was a new chapter ahead of us, and I was ready to face it with those I cared about. Even though our relationship would never be the same again, I knew that we were wiser and stronger now, and that our family would be able to overcome any difficulties.